The land of water and stone. Long before the first tower rose at Angkor, before kings carved their names into stone, this land was already telling its story, quietly, patiently through water and earth. It spoke in the slow breath of monsoon clouds, in the widening and narrowing of a great lake, in the rhythm of flood and retreat that shaped every life that came to depend upon it. At dawn, mist lifts gently from the plains of what is now Cambodia. The air is warm and heavy, carrying the scent of wet soil and growing rice. Somewhere in the distance, birds call from flooded forests. This is a land not ruled by mountains or deserts, but by water, by its abundance, its absence, and its strange, life-giving movements. At the heart of this world lies the great inland sea known as Tonle Sap. For half the year, it expands outward like a living thing, swallowing forests and fields as monsoon rains swell the rivers. Then, as the rains fade, it slowly exhales, shrinking back to its dry season form and leaving behind fertile silt. Few places on earth behave this way. Fewer still shape an entire civilization so completely. To the north and east, the long body of the Mekong flows steadily, linking the interior of the continent to distant lands and seas. It brings not only water, but people, traders, ideas, beliefs, moving quietly along its course over centuries. Geography here does not merely frame history. It guides it, limits it, and at times makes it possible at all. This was never an easy land to master. Floods could nourish crops or destroy them. Drought could arrive slowly, unnoticed, until reservoirs fell silent and fields cracked open under the sun. To live here required attention, patience, and memory, the kind of knowledge passed down across generations, learned by watching the sky and listening to the earth. Long before there was an empire, there were villages. Wooden houses raised on stilts stood above the seasonal waters. Families planted rice in careful cycles, fished the floodplains, and traveled by boat more often than by road. Life followed the calendar of rain and retreat. Survival depended not on conquest, but on cooperation with neighbors and with nature itself. Over time, these communities began to connect. Rivers became pathways rather than boundaries. Small chiefs and local leaders emerged, their authority tied to their ability to manage water, protect fields, and maintain harmony with unseen forces believed to inhabit land and sky. Power in these early centuries was intimate and fragile. Beyond these plains, the wider world was already in motion. To the west, the Indian Ocean carried merchants from South Asia, bringing cloth beads, metals, and stories of gods who lived on cosmic mountains. To the east, the South China Sea connected coastal settlements to China and beyond. Southeast Asia sat quietly between these worlds, absorbing influence without losing itself. From India came new ideas, writing systems, ritual practices, and concepts of divine kingship. These ideas did not arrive as armies. They arrived slowly through marriage alliances, trade, and the patient work of priests and scholars. Local traditions did not disappear. They blended, adapted, and endured. Stone sanctuaries began to appear in the forests. Not grand temples yet, but modest shrines, markers of sacred ground places where the human and divine were believed to meet. These early structures hinted at something to come, a culture increasingly confident in shaping its environment both materially and spiritually. Yet this land remained fragmented. Power rose and fell with the seasons. Floods could erase borders. Drought could undo authority. What was missing was permanence, a system capable of holding memory across generations, of storing not just water, but meaning and control. The answer, though not yet fully formed, lay hidden in plain sight. Water could be guided, stone could endure. If rivers could be redirected and reservoirs made vast enough to outlast dry years, then power might become something lasting rather than fleeting. This realization would take centuries to mature. It would require rulers willing to command labor on a massive scale and populations willing or compelled to participate. It would require belief systems strong enough to justify such efforts, convincing people that digging canals and raising embankments was not merely work, but sacred duty. For now the land waited. Forests crept back over abandoned clearings. Rivers shifted their courses by degrees too small to notice in a single lifetime. Children grew old telling the same stories their grandparents once told them, stories of spirits in water, of ancestors watching from unseen realms. Somewhere in these quiet centuries, the seeds of Angkor were already present. Not as a city, not as an empire, but as a possibility shaped by geography and time. The land itself was preparing the stage, laying down patterns that future kings would learn to read and eventually to command. When the time came for a ruler to claim the center of this world, to bind waterstone labor and belief into a single vision, the foundations would already be there, hidden beneath rice fields and flooded forests, waiting to be revealed. And so, as the mist lifts and the lake breathes once more, the story moves gently forward toward the first kingdoms, the first experiments in power, and the long road that would lead slowly and inevitably to Angkor. The scattered communities of this watery land begin to draw together as early kingdoms rise and fall, and the idea of kingship itself starts to take shape. Before Angkor, Funan, Chenla, and the road to kingship. Long before Angkor gathered stone and water into a single vision power in this land, moved like the rivers themselves, branching, merging, and sometimes disappearing beneath the surface. The plains were already alive with people and memory, yet no single center held them for long. What existed instead were shifting networks of influence bound together by trade belief and the promise of stability in a landscape ruled by the seasons. In the centuries before, Angkor communities along the Mekong and its tributaries began to look outward as much as inward. Boats carried rice fish resin and forest goods downstream, while returning with metal tools, glass beads, and cloth from distant shores. These journeys did more than move goods. They carried ideas, stories of gods, rituals, and kings, whose authority came not only from strength, but from sacred connection. Out of this world emerged one of Southeast Asia's earliest known political formations, Funan. It was not a kingdom in the later sense, with fixed borders and a single capital, but rather a loose constellation of ports and river settlements. Its power flowed from its position between worlds, between inland producers and maritime traders, moving between India and China. Chinese chroniclers, observing from afar, described Funan as wealthy and sophisticated, a place where rulers commanded loyalty through ritual and trade rather than sheer force. Its leaders adopted elements of Indian culture, selectively Sanskrit titles, Hindu deities, and concepts of cosmic order that linked kingship to the structure of the universe. Yet these ideas rested upon local foundations, older beliefs in land spirits, ancestors, and the living presence of water. Funan's prosperity depended on openness. As long as trade flowed and alliances held, it thrived. But openness also brought vulnerability. Control could not be enforced across long distances, and authority weakened as routes shifted and rival centers emerged. By the 6th century, Funan faded from prominence not through sudden collapse, but through gradual absorption into new power structures further inland. From this transition arose Chenla, a name used to describe a series of polities that marked a turning inward from the coast toward the river valleys and forests. Chenla was less maritime and more agrarian. Its leaders focused on controlling land rather than ports, on cultivating rice rather than taxing trade. This shift reflected deeper changes in how power was imagined. Authority now came from mastery of territory and labor, not simply from participation in international exchange. Stone inscriptions from this period speak of kings who cleared land, dug canals, and founded temples. These acts were not merely practical, they were symbolic. To transform landscape was to demonstrate favor from the gods and command over unseen forces. Clearing forest became an act of creation, echoing myths in which order emerged from chaos. Yet, Chenla, like Funan before, it was not unified for long. Power fractured into competing centers, sometimes described as Land Chenla and Water Chenla, each oriented toward different resources and regions. Kings rose and fell quickly. Alliances shifted. Conflict simmered beneath the surface, rarely erupting into total war, but always threatening instability. Despite this fragmentation, something important was taking shape. The idea of kingship was becoming more ambitious. Rulers no longer presented themselves merely as chiefs or war leaders, but as cosmic figures, mediators between heaven and earth. Temples grew larger, more permanent, built from stone rather than wood. Rituals became more elaborate, tying political loyalty to religious obligation. The people, meanwhile, lived lives deeply entwined with the land. Farmers followed monsoon rhythms with careful precision. Villages clustered near reliable water sources. Craftspeople shaped bronze and stone. Priests preserved rituals that linked human action to cosmic balance. Life was demanding but not chaotic, so long as the rains came on time and leaders upheld their duties. Still, the system remained fragile. Without a strong central authority, large-scale water management was limited. Canals and embankments existed, but they were local in scope. Droughts and floods could still unravel political order. What was missing was a unifying vision, someone who could bind the land together through belief, infrastructure, and force. External pressures added to this sense of urgency. To the east, emerging Vietnamese polities expanded southward. To the west, rival groups contested fertile plains. Trade routes shifted again, favoring different ports and inland crossings. The world was changing, and the older, looser forms of authority struggled to keep pace. In these conditions, ambition quietly grew. The notion took hold that only a ruler with divine sanction could impose lasting order on such a demanding landscape. Kingship, once flexible and local, began to reach for permanence. Sacred mountains became central symbols. The idea that the ruler embodied the axis of the universe linking gods, ancestors, and people gained strength. Temples were no longer just places of worship, but statements of cosmic alignment. To rule was to maintain balance, and failure to do so invited disaster. By the late 8th century, the stage was set. The scattered traditions of Funan and Chenla had laid essential groundwork, systems of belief, models of governance, and early experiments in water control. The land had taught its lessons patiently. Now it awaited someone bold enough to listen and powerful enough to act. In the quiet forests and river valleys, whispers of change gathered. A new kind of ruler was about to emerge, one who would claim not just kingship, but universal authority. When he stepped forward, the age of experiment would end, and the age of empire would begin. Here, at the edge of myth and history, the road narrows toward a single moment when one man would declare himself ruler of the world and the Khmer Empire would be born. Jayavarman II, and the birth of a sacred empire. The moment does not arrive with trumpets or crowds. It comes quietly in a landscape already heavy with meaning. Forested hills rise gently from the plains, and stone outcrops break through the earth like ancient bones. Here, away from the great rivers and markets, the air feels older, still attentive, as if waiting. In the year 802, a man named Jayavarman II steps into history. Little is known about his early life with certainty. What survives comes in fragments, later inscriptions, careful phrases carved long after the moment itself. Yet from these fragments emerges a figure of unusual ambition, shaped by the fractured world that came before him. He had seen division. He had lived among competing rulers and shifting loyalties, and he understood perhaps more clearly than any before him that this land demanded more than temporary authority. Jayavarman II did not merely want to rule, he wanted to end fragmentation itself. The ceremony that defines his legacy takes place on a sacred mountain plateau far from the reach of rival courts. There, through ritual and proclamation, he declares himself Suryavarman, a universal ruler. This was not a political title alone, it was a cosmic claim. To be Suryavarman was to stand at the center of the world, to embody order, and to ensure harmony between the human realm and the divine. In that moment, kingship changes. No longer is the ruler simply first among equals, or the strongest among many. The king becomes the living axis of the universe, a figure whose authority flows from sacred legitimacy as much as from force. To challenge him is not merely rebellion, it is disorder, a threat to balance itself. This idea did not come from nowhere. It drew on centuries of belief shaped by Indian cosmology and local spiritual traditions. Mountains had long been seen as sacred places where gods dwelled and the worlds touched. By choosing such a setting, Jayavarman II anchored his rule in the deepest symbolic language his people understood. The declaration was both spiritual and practical. With it came a new political reality, the formal unification of previously competing regions under a single sacred authority. Chiefs and local rulers were no longer independent powers. They became participants in a larger order bound by ritual obligation and the king's will. Yet this unification did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually through alliances, marriages, and displays of ritual power. Temples were founded not only as places of worship, but as markers of loyalty. Land grants tied local elites to the central court. Authority spread outward like ripples on water. Jayavarman II moved his capital more than once, testing locations, consolidating control, adapting to geography. These early centers were modest compared to what Angkor would become, but they were intentional, carefully placed near resources, labor, and transport routes. The king was learning how to anchor power in the land itself. What distinguished his reign was not monumental construction, but conceptual transformation. He redefined what it meant to rule. The king was now the guarantor of fertility, the protector of the people, and the maintainer of cosmic order. If the rains failed or enemies advanced, responsibility rested not with fate, but with the ruler's relationship to the divine. For the people, this shift offered something new: stability. A single sacred authority promised continuity across generations. It justified large-scale cooperation, digging canals, building temples, mobilizing labor, not as burdens, but as acts of shared purpose. Still, the system was young and vulnerable. It depended heavily on the personal authority of the king. Without strong successors, it could unravel. Jayavarman VII understood this, and toward the end of his reign, he worked to secure continuity, embedding sacred kingship into ritual practice rather than personality alone. When he dies sometime in the early 9th century, he leaves behind no grand capital, no vast temple complex. What he leaves instead is more powerful an idea. The Khmer world now understands itself as an empire in waiting, centered on a king who stands between earth and sky. The land responds slowly, forests remain, rivers continue their ancient rhythms. But beneath the surface, something has shifted. Authority is no longer scattered. It has a center. And from that center, the next generation of rulers will begin the patient work of turning vision into stone. As the embers of Jayavarman II's reign fade, his successors inherit both promise and burden. They must give physical form to sacred kingship. They must build a capital worthy of the cosmic claim already made. And so the story moves forward away from mountain sanctuaries and into the lowlands toward a place where water labor and belief will finally converge. Laying the foundations of Angkor. The world Jayavarman VII left behind was unified in spirit, but still searching for a physical heart. Sacred kingship had been declared, yet it needed a place where ritual administration and daily life could gather and endure. After his death, the task passed quietly to his successors' men, who understood that ideas alone could not hold an empire together. Stone water and labor would have to carry the vision forward. The lowlands north of the Tonle Sap offered promise. Here the land was flat and open rich with seasonal floods and fertile soil. Rivers branched gently through forests and fields, and the great lake nearby acted as both storehouse and regulator, feeding canals and sustaining life during dry months. This was a landscape that rewarded careful attention and punished neglect. Early Khmer rulers began to settle more permanently in this region. Capital shifted less frequently, now lingering longer in chosen locations. Wooden palaces and ritual enclosures rose on raised earth platforms, modest in appearance but deliberate in design. These early centers were not yet Angkor, as it would later be known, but they carried its first outlines. Temples multiplied. Each king founded shrines dedicated to Hindu deities, often linked to their own spiritual identity. These were acts of devotion, but also of politics. To build a temple was to mark territory, to bind land and people to royal authority. Inscriptions carved into stone recorded gifts of rice fields, laborers, and cattle, quietly mapping a growing administrative system. Alongside temples came the earliest large-scale waterworks. Channels were widened, embankments strengthened. Reservoirs, still small by later standards, were dug to capture monsoon rains. These efforts demanded coordination and discipline, drawing communities into shared projects that extended beyond village life. Water management became a language of power. A ruler who could store water through the dry season could guarantee harvests, reduce famine, and command loyalty. Failure, on the other hand, was visible to all. When reservoirs ran dry or fields flooded uncontrollably, confidence in kingship faltered. The 9th century unfolded as a time of experimentation. Rulers tested how far authority could reach, how much labor could be mobilized, and how belief could be translated into infrastructure. Mistakes were made. Some projects failed. Capitals were abandoned and rebuilt. But each attempt left knowledge behind. Stone construction advanced slowly. Builders learned how sandstone behaved under weight and weather. Decorative styles became more confident, more distinctly Khmer. Mythological scenes carved onto temple walls connected local rulers to cosmic narratives, reinforcing their place within a sacred order. Court life, too, grew more complex. Officials emerged to oversee land grants, labor obligations, and temple estates. These administrators were often members of elite families tied to the king through marriage and favor. Power concentrated gradually, not through sudden decree, but through accumulated habit. Beyond the court, ordinary life continued much as it always had. Farmers watched the sky, fishermen followed the floodwaters, markets gathered at crossroads and riverbanks, yet even here change was felt. Taxes became more regular, labor service more structured. The presence of royal authority grew harder to ignore. The forests around these early capitals thinned as land was cleared for rice cultivation, paths became roads, sacred sites multiplied. The landscape itself began to reflect human attention on a larger scale. By the end of the 9th century, something remarkable had taken shape, a stable center of power anchored in the northern plains, capable of enduring beyond a single reign. The idea of Angkor as a permanent seat of empire was no longer abstract. It was emerging quietly, piece by piece. Still, the empire remained cautious. Expansion was limited. Consolidation came first. The lessons of earlier fragmentation were not forgotten. Stability, the rulers understood, was earned slowly. As the 10th century approached, confidence grew. The foundations were laid. The land was being shaped to sustain not just a kingdom, but something larger, an empire that could command water labor belief and time itself. What remained was to test this system beyond its heartland, to see whether the structures forming around Angkor could support growth, rivalry, and ambition. And so, with the foundation set, the empire begins to look outward toward expansion, confrontation, and the first true measure of its strength. Water labor and the engine of empire. The true strength of the Khmer Empire did not rise first in stone towers or royal titles. It emerged quietly through earth, cut open by human hands through channels that guided water where it was needed most. Long before Angkor astonished the world with temples, it learned to command something far more essential, the movement of water across the land. In the low plains north of the Great Lake, the rains were both blessing and threat. When the monsoon arrived on time, fields flooded gently, and rice thrived. When it came late or not at all, hunger followed. The early Khmer kings understood that lasting power depended on reducing this uncertainty, not by resisting nature, but by working with it. Canals were extended carefully, linking rivers, reservoirs, and fields. Embankments were raised to slow floodwaters and release them gradually. Seasonal streams were shaped into predictable channels. These works did not happen all at once. They grew year by year, guided by observation, memory, and trial. Each successful harvest reinforced the system. Rice surpluses supported growing populations and freed labor for projects beyond survival. With food secured, people could be summoned for weeks or months at a time to dig, to carry stone, to build. Labor itself became a resource organized and directed by the state. This was the engine of empire. The king stood at its center not merely as commander, but as coordinator. His legitimacy rested on visible results. Full granaries, stable villages, and functioning canals were signs that cosmic order was being maintained. When water flowed correctly, faith in kingship deepened. Labor obligations were structured around seasons. During planting and harvest, villagers remained close to home. In drier months, they were summoned to work on state projects. This rhythm allowed the empire to grow without fully disrupting daily life, binding people to the system rather than breaking them against it. Waterworks also reshaped the landscape itself. Areas once too dry or too flooded for cultivation were brought into use. Settlements expanded outward from the core. The reach of Angkor lengthened, not through conquest alone, but through the steady extension of managed land. These systems demanded constant care, canals clogged with silt, embankments weakened under heavy rain. Reservoirs required repair and expansion. The empire's strength therefore depended on continuity, on knowledge passed from one generation of engineers and laborers to the next. Failure was always possible. A neglected canal could undo years of work. A ruler distracted by war or ritual could allow decay to set in. Water management was unforgiving. It rewarded attention and punished neglect without mercy. Yet during this period, the system held. The empire learned how to sustain complexity. Administrative records tracked land and labor. Officials supervised construction and maintenance. Temples often played a role as local centers of organization, linking spiritual life to practical governance. As confidence grew, ambition followed. Reservoirs became larger, networks more intricate. The land around Angkor transformed into a carefully managed mosaic of fields, waterways, and settlements, each dependent on the whole. This mastery of water gave the Khmer rulers something rare in the pre-modern world: resilience. While neighboring regions suffered periodic famine or instability, Angkor could often endure. Its surplus fed armies, supported artisans, and underwrote monumental construction yet to come. Stone temples would one day capture the world's attention, but they rested on invisible foundations, on mud silt, and disciplined labor moving in quiet coordination. With this engine in place, the empire was ready to test its strength beyond the heartland. The systems that fed Angkor could now support armies' diplomacy and expansion. The question was no longer whether the empire could endure, but how far it could reach. And so, as canals stretched farther across the plains and reservoirs held the monsoon's promise, the Khmer world turned its gaze outward toward rivals' borders and the first true trials of imperial power. Expansion across the plains. With water secured and labor organized, the Khmer Empire began to move beyond its birthplace. Expansion did not arrive as a sudden wave of conquest. It unfolded gradually, almost quietly, following rivers, rice lands, and long-established routes of movement and exchange. Power extended outward the same way canals did, branch by branch, connecting distant places back to the center. From Angkor's growing heartland, influence spread westward across the plains of what is now central Thailand, northward toward the forested uplands, and eastward along river corridors leading toward the coast. Some regions were drawn in through force, others through alliance tribute and shared religious culture. Expansion was rarely uniform. It adapted to terrain, people, and circumstance. Khmer armies during this period were not standing forces kept year-round. They were assembled when needed, drawn from the same population that farmed the fields and maintained the canals. Success depended on timing campaigns launched after harvests, before the heaviest rains, when supply lines could be sustained. The empire's agricultural system made such coordination possible. Yet military strength alone did not hold new territories. Temples followed conquest and diplomacy alike, Shrines dedicated to Hindu deities appeared in newly absorbed regions built in Khmer style and aligned with Angkor's sacred geography. These were more than religious structures. They were statements of belonging, anchoring local elites to imperial authority. Local rulers were often left in place, transformed into officials rather than eliminated. Tribute replaced independence. Loyalty was reinforced through marriage alliances, ritual obligations, and participation in the empire's ceremonial life. This approach reduced resistance and allowed the empire to grow without constant warfare. Trade expanded alongside political reach. Rice forest products and luxury goods moved more freely across imperial space. Roads and waterways were improved, linking distant regions to Angkor. The capital increasingly functioned as a hub not just of power, but of culture and belief. Still, expansion carried risks. Distance strained communication. Local traditions resisted full integration. Some regions accepted Khmer authority in name, but remained loosely controlled in practice. Rebellions flared, occasionally reminders that empire required constant attention. Rival powers watched closely. To the east, emerging Vietnamese states pressed southward. To the west, other Thai-speaking groups were beginning their own movements into fertile lowlands. The world beyond Angkor was not static. Expansion brought the empire into contact and competition with neighbors who would one day challenge its dominance. Within Angkor, success bred confidence. Kings commissioned larger projects. Court ritual grew more elaborate. The idea that Angkor stood at the center of the world felt increasingly real to those who lived within its orbit. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Khmer Empire had become the preeminent power of mainland Southeast Asia. Its reach was broad, its systems robust, its vision clear. Yet even as it expanded, the empire remained dependent on balance between center and periphery, belief and force water and labor. These tensions did not yet threaten collapse. Instead, they fueled creativity and ambition. The rulers of this era believed the empire had not yet reached its full expression. Greater monuments, greater harmony between heaven and earth still lay ahead. As expansion slowed and consolidation resumed, attention turned inward once more toward refinement, stability, and the approach of a cultural and architectural flowering unlike anything the region had known before. Suryavarman II and the Dream in Stone. There comes a moment in every empire when power seeks permanence, not merely in memory or ritual, but in something that can outlast a human life. For the Khmer Empire, that moment arrives in the early 12th century, during the reign of a ruler whose ambition was measured not only in territory, but in stone. His name was Suryavarman II. He rose to power through struggle emerging from a period of internal conflict that had tested the unity of the empire. When he secured the throne, he did so with a clear understanding of what was required to hold it. Authority needed to be visible, it needed to feel inevitable, and it needed to be woven into the fabric of the world itself. Suryavarman II ruled at a time when Angkor stood near the height of its strength. The water systems were mature, the population was vast, the administrative machinery functioned with practiced efficiency. What remained was to give the empire its ultimate expression, one that would mirror the cosmos and declare without words the legitimacy of the king. The project he envisioned would become Angkor Wat. Rising from the flat plains like a stone mountain, the temple was conceived as a physical image of the universe. Its central tower represented Mount Meru, the sacred center of Hindu cosmology, home of the gods. Surrounding galleries echoed the concentric continents and oceans of mythic geography. Every measurement, alignment, and carving carried symbolic meaning. Construction unfolded over decades. Tens of thousands of laborers quarried sandstone from distant hills, transported it along canals, and shaped it with extraordinary precision. Artisans carved endless processions of celestial dancers, gods and kings into the walls, figures that seemed to move even in stillness, illuminated by shifting light. Angkor Wat was dedicated to Vishnu, the preserver of cosmic order, a choice that reflected Suryavarman II's vision of kingship. He did not present himself as a conqueror alone, but as a guardian of balance, a ruler whose duty was to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and people. The temple faced west, an unusual orientation, often associated with death and the setting sun. Some scholars believe it was intended as both a state temple and a mausoleum, a place where the king's spirit would join the divine order he had spent his life upholding. Beyond its religious purpose, Angkor Wat functioned as a political statement of unmatched clarity. It proclaimed the empire's wealth, organizational power, and cultural confidence. No rival could look upon it without understanding the scale of Angkor's ambition. Life continued around the temple as it rose. Farmers tended fields nourished by canals. Markets thrived. Court ceremonies unfolded beneath banners and incense. Yet Angkor Wat stood apart, calm, immovable, eternal in appearance, even as the world around it remained in motion. Suryavarman II also pursued military campaigns extending Khmer influence into neighboring regions. These efforts reinforced the image of a king favored by the gods, capable of enforcing order beyond the heartland. Victory and construction fed one another, each strengthening the other's meaning. When Suryavarman II died, Angkor Wat remained complete enough to fulfill its purpose, yet still gathering meaning with each generation. It became the spiritual and symbolic heart of the empire, a place where stone carried memory more faithfully than words ever could. In its corridors and courtyards, the Khmer Empire had given form to its highest ideals. But perfection, once achieved, brings its own quiet tension. The empire had reached a peak that could not easily be surpassed, only maintained, adapted, or slowly transformed. As the shadow of Angkor Wat stretched across the plains at sunset, new questions began to surface. Could the balance so carefully carved in stone endure the pressures of time, belief, and change? The answers would come not in sudden collapse, but in subtle shifts, emerging quietly, even as the empire stood at its most magnificent. Daily life at the height of Angkor. At the height of Angkor's power, life unfolded with a quiet confidence that came from abundance and routine. Beyond the great temples and royal processions, beyond the inscriptions that praised kings and gods, there existed a vast breathing world of ordinary days lived by farmers, artisans, monks, traders, and families whose names were never carved into stone. As morning light spread across the plains, villages stirred. Houses of wood and thatch stood raised on stilts above the earth, protecting families from floods and insects alike. Beneath them, animals moved slowly in the shade. Smoke drifted upward as fires were lit for cooking rice, the staple that shaped both diet and destiny. Fields stretched outward from the settlements, their boundaries marked by low embankments and narrow channels that guided water with careful precision. Farmers worked in rhythm with the seasons, their labor timed to the monsoon's arrival and retreat. The success of their harvests depended not only on rain, but on the vast hydraulic system that connected their fields to distant reservoirs and canals. Even those who never saw Angkor's temples were bound to the capital through water. Fishing was just as essential. When the Great Lake swelled, fish moved into flooded forests in astonishing numbers. Nets were cast from boats and from the edges of submerged trees. The abundance was such that fish were dried, fermented, and stored, feeding the population through the dry months. This quiet wealth sustained the empire as surely as rice. Markets gathered where paths crossed, and boats came ashore. Here the empire revealed its diversity. Goods arrived from distant regions, salt metals, ceramics, cloth alongside local produce and forest products. Voices blended with the sounds of bargaining laughter and ritual chanting, drifting from nearby shrines. Trade was not merely economic, it was social, binding people across regions and classes. Religion shaped daily rhythms as deeply as work. Hindu and Buddhist practices coexisted sometimes within the same community. Temples, large and small, dotted the landscape, serving as places of worship, education, and local administration. Monks walked barefoot along paths at dawn, accepting offerings of food in silence. Rituals marked births, deaths, and seasonal changes, tying personal life to cosmic order. Artisans worked in stone, bronze, wood, and clay. Their skill was evident not only in grand monuments, but in everyday objects, tools, vessels, ornaments that carried both beauty and function. Training passed through families and guilds, preserving techniques refined over generations. At the center of this world stood the royal court. Court officials oversaw land grants, labor obligations, and temple estates. Scribes recorded donations and decrees on stone and palm leaf. Dancers performed sacred movements believed to please the gods and reinforce harmony. Life near the court was structured, ceremonial, and demanding, but it also offered status and security. Social hierarchy was clear, yet not rigidly fixed. Merit service and royal favor could elevate families over time. Temples and administration provided paths to influence beyond birth alone. Still, inequality existed, quietly accepted as part of cosmic order. Despite the empire's vastness, communication remained personal. News traveled by boat and road, carried by messengers and traders. Stories of the king's deeds, of victories and temple dedications spread, gradually shaping a shared sense of belonging. From a distance, Angkor appeared timeless and unchanging, but within this stability, subtle shifts were already underway. Religious ideas continued to evolve. Population pressures tested the land. Maintenance of canals required constant effort. These changes were not yet crises, only whispers beneath the steady rhythm of daily life. As dusk settled, lamps flickered in homes and temples. The sounds of the day softened into evening quiet. Above it all, the stone towers of Angkor stood unmoving, reflecting moonlight, seeming to promise that this order would last forever. Yet no empire remained suspended at its peak. Even in moments of greatest balance, the seeds of change are present, waiting patiently for time to turn them into motion. Jayavarman VII and the Buddhist turn. The moment of transformation arrives not in calm, but in shock. In the late 12th century, Angkor is shaken by invasion. Forces from the east, known in Khmer records as the Cham, strike deep into the empire's heartland. Temples are damaged, authority disrupted, and the illusion of invulnerability broken. For a civilization built on order and balance, the impact is profound. Out of this disruption rises a ruler unlike any before him. Jayavarman VII comes to power not merely as a restorer of territory, but as a reimaginer of kingship itself. Where earlier rulers emphasized divine distance, he leans toward compassion. Where stone once proclaimed cosmic authority, it now begins to speak of suffering and care. Jayavarman VII is a Buddhist, specifically a follower of Mahayana Buddhism. This faith does not reject kingship, but reshapes it. The ruler is no longer only a god-king. He is a bodhisattva, a being who delays personal enlightenment to relieve the suffering of others. In this vision, power carries moral responsibility. After driving out the invaders and reasserting control, Jayavarman VII begins one of the most ambitious building programs in Khmer history. Yet the tone has changed. The temples he commissions do not celebrate distant gods alone, but human experience, compassion, endurance, and shared vulnerability. At the center of this new vision stands a new capital Angkor Wat. Its walls are vast, its gates monumental, but its heart is different. The Bayon Temple rises at its center, crowned with serene stone faces that gaze outward in every direction. These faces, calm, watchful, faintly smiling, seem less commanding than contemplative, as if the empire itself is learning to reflect. Jayavarman VII builds not only temples, but hospitals. Roads stretch outward from Angkor, lined with rest houses where travelers may find shelter. Bridges cross rivers with deliberate grace. For the first time, imperial power is visibly concerned with the welfare of ordinary people. This shift resonates deeply. Buddhism spreads more widely among the population, offering a spiritual language that speaks directly to suffering and impermanence. Temples become places not just of ritual, but of refuge. Kingship, once distant and absolute, feels closer, more human. Yet this transformation carries tension. The massive building projects demand enormous labor. Maintaining both new monuments and old hydraulic systems strains resources. The older Hindu elite does not disappear overnight, and religious plurality sometimes becomes religious competition. The empire remains strong, but its balance grows more delicate. Jayavarman VII rules for decades, leaving an imprint deeper than any ruler before him. When he dies, the empire mourns, but it also stands at a crossroads. His vision has changed the moral and spiritual direction of Khmer society. The question now is whether the structures of power can adapt fully to this new understanding of authority. Stone faces remain, roads endure, but beneath them the meaning of kingship has shifted forever. As the 13th century approaches, Angkor is still magnificent, still powerful, but it is no longer the same empire that built Angkor Wat. Compassion has entered the architecture. Impermanence has entered belief. And with these changes come new pressures, quiet at first, gathering slowly beneath the surface of greatness. The quiet strains beneath greatness. From a distance, Angkor still appears unshakable. Its reservoirs glimmer beneath the sun. Its temples rise calmly from the plains. Processions still move through stone gates, and rituals continue as they always have. Yet beneath this surface of continuity, the empire begins to feel the weight of its own complexity. The changes are subtle at first, almost invisible to those living within them. The hydraulic system, once Angkor's greatest strength, now demands constant attention. Canals must be cleared of silt, embankments repaired after heavy rains, reservoirs balanced carefully to avoid both flooding and drought. These tasks require coordination across generations. When attention falters even briefly, problems compound. Population growth intensifies pressure on the land. Fields are cultivated more intensively. leaving less room for recovery. Forests retreat farther from the core. The margins between abundance and scarcity narrow. The system still works, but it no longer has room for error. At court, power grows more fragmented. The religious transformation begun under Jayavarman VII has altered the foundations of authority. Kings are no longer distant divine figures in quite the same way. Their moral responsibilities are greater, but their unquestioned command is softer. This change brings compassion, but also challenge. Elite families gain influence through temple networks and land grants. Authority becomes more distributed, less centered entirely on the king. Decisions slow. Rivalries deepen quietly, expressed through ritual precedents rather than open conflict. Climate, too, begins to shift. Monsoon patterns become less predictable. Some years bring excessive rain overwhelming canals. Others bring droughts that stretch reservoirs thin. These fluctuations are not catastrophic on their own, but they expose the limits of even the most sophisticated system. The empire adapts, as it always has, through repair ritual and reorganization. Yet adaptation now requires more effort for diminishing returns. Each solution feels temporary, each success fragile. Externally, pressure grows. Neighboring regions watch Angkor's wealth and influence with growing confidence of their own. Trade routes begin to shift toward maritime paths, slowly reducing Angkor's centrality in regional exchange. The empire remains powerful, but the world around it is changing. For the people, daily life continues much as before. Rice is planted, fish are caught, markets gather. Yet stories circulate of failed canals of temples left unfinished of authority that feels less certain than it once did. No single moment marks the beginning of decline. Instead, the empire enters a long season of strain where maintaining greatness becomes harder than achieving it. Angkor still stands in balance, but now that balance requires constant vigilance. And time patient and unyielding begins to test what stone and water can truly endure. Faith changes, power shifts. Change enters Angkor without noise. There are no banners announcing it, no armies marching through the gates, no temples falling into ruin overnight. Instead, the shift arrives in softer ways, through quiet sermons beneath trees, through monks walking barefoot along village paths, through ideas that require no stone to endure. By the early 13th century, the spiritual world of the Khmer Empire is slowly turning inward. For centuries, power in Angkor had been inseparable from sacred kingship. The ruler stood at the center of the universe, a living bridge between heaven and earth. Temples of stone affirm this truth, rising as permanent symbols of cosmic order. The people worked, prayed, and labored within a system that placed divine authority firmly at the top. Now that order begins to loosen. Theravada Buddhism, once peripheral, spread steadily across the empire. It does not arrive through royal decree. It spreads because it is simple, portable, and deeply human. Its teachings focus not on cosmic hierarchy, but on personal conduct, on suffering impermanence, and the quiet discipline of the mind. For farmers, fishermen, artisans, and traders, this message resonates. One does not need a god-king to walk the path toward peace. One does not need a monumental temple to hear the teachings. Enlightenment is no longer something mediated through royal ritual. It becomes something intimate, available to anyone willing to listen and practice. Monasteries appear near villages and markets built of wood and earth rather than stone. They leave little trace for future archaeologists, but they reshape daily life profoundly. Monks teach in local languages, Rituals become simpler. Merit is gained through generosity and ethical living rather than proximity to power. Slowly, the emotional center of Khmer society moves away from the court. Kings still rule, courts still function. Temples like Angkor Wat and the Payon still stand in awe-inspiring silence. But the meaning of authority changes. The ruler is no longer seen as a semi-divine being whose success guarantees cosmic balance. He is increasingly viewed as a powerful but impermanent human figure, subject like all others to the laws of change. This transformation brings peace, but it also brings uncertainty. As sacred distance fades, so does unquestioned obedience. Elite families, temple administrators, and regional leaders gain greater independence. Authority becomes layered rather than centralized. Decisions that once flowed smoothly from the capital now fragment into local concerns. Land grants tied to temples function with increasing autonomy. Labor obligations soften. Central oversight of large projects weakens not through rebellion, but through disengagement. People still respect the king, but they no longer depend on him spiritually. The great hydraulic system begins to feel this change. Water management requires coordination across vast distances and long periods of time. Canals must be maintained consistently, not just locally. Reservoirs must be balanced with care. When authority fragments, maintenance becomes uneven. Some regions keep their channels clear. Others neglect them. The system continues to function, but less efficiently with each passing decade. No single failure announces the problem. Instead, small inefficiencies accumulate. A canal silts slightly more than before. An embankment repair is delayed. A reservoir holds less water than it once did. Each issue seems manageable. Together, they quietly erode resilience. Religious life offers comfort in this changing world. Theravada teachings encourage acceptance of impermanence. Suffering, they say, is natural. Clinging to permanence only deepens pain. For individuals, this philosophy brings solace. For an empire built on permanence, it carries unintended consequences. The idea that all things pass makes the loss of centralized power feel less alarming. Stone monuments remain, but fewer are built. The era of vast temple construction fades. Resources flow instead toward local monasteries and communities. Angkor's skyline no longer changes dramatically. It becomes ancient, even to those who live beside it. At court, rituals continue, but their tone shifts. Ceremonies feel more traditional than transformative. Kings rule in the shadow of their predecessors' achievements, unable or unwilling to recreate the scale of earlier grandeur. Yet daily life remains calm. Rice is planted and harvested. Fish fill the flooded forests. Markets gather as they always have. Monks chant softly at dawn. To the people living within it, the empire does not feel as though it is ending. It feels as though it is settling into age. But history is shaped not only by how a world feels from within, but by how it is seen from without. As Angkor's spiritual and political center softens, its neighbors observe carefully. They see not collapse, but opportunity. They see a great power no longer tightly bound to its core. And beyond the forests and plains, new kingdoms rise lighter, more flexible, and increasingly confident that the age of Angkor is passing. The shift is not yet violent, it is not yet decisive, but it is real. The empire has changed its soul, and once the soul changes, the body must eventually follow. Neighbors rise as Angkor weakens. As Angkor's inner cohesion softens, the wider world does not pause to wait. beyond the forests and plains that once lay securely within Khmer, influence new centers of power, are gathering strength. They rise not in imitation of Angkor's monumental grandeur, but in response to a changing age, an age in which flexibility begins to matter more than permanence. By the early 14th century, the balance of mainland Southeast Asia has shifted. The great inland empire that once commanded rivers and labor now finds itself increasingly distant from the roots that shape regional wealth. Trade, which had long flowed along rivers into Angkor's heartland, begins to favor the sea. Maritime networks expand, linking ports more directly to China, India, and the wider world. Inland capitals, however magnificent, feel the change first as absence fewer caravans, fewer goods, fewer reasons for outsiders to pass through. To the west, along fertile river valleys closer to the coast, new Thai-speaking kingdoms organize themselves with remarkable speed. Their rulers embrace Theravada Buddhism, as Angkor has, but they shape power differently. Kings rule with fewer layers of ritual. Courts are lighter, more mobile. Authority rests less on cosmic symbolism and more on personal leadership, alliance, and adaptability. Among these rising powers, Ayutthaya emerges with particular clarity. Positioned advantageously near waterways that connect inland rice lands to maritime trade, it becomes a gathering point for goods people and ambition. Its rulers learn quickly how to draw strength from commerce while maintaining agricultural stability, a balance Angkor once mastered but now struggles to sustain. Relations between Angkor and its neighbors do not immediately turn hostile. For years, diplomacy continues. Tribute is negotiated. Borders remain fluid. Cultural exchange persists, especially through shared Buddhist practice. Yet beneath this surface calm lies a growing awareness. Angkor is no longer the unquestioned center. Within the Khmer realm, responses vary. Some rulers attempt to reaffirm authority through ritual reviving older symbols of kingship. Others accept decentralization as inevitable, focusing on maintaining local stability rather than imperial reach. There is no single strategy, no decisive reform that rebinds the empire's scattered energies. Military encounters along the frontiers become more frequent. They are often small in scale, but revealing in consequence. Khmer forces, once supported by abundant surplus and seamless coordination, now find campaigns harder to sustain. Supply lines stretch thin, allies hesitate. Victories, when achieved, are costly and temporary. The hydraulic system, still functioning, offers diminishing advantage in warfare. Canals that once moved rice efficiently now require careful maintenance simply to operate at past levels. The system that fed armies effortlessly now demands protection itself. For the people living near Angkor, these shifts register slowly. Life continues. Fields are planted, temples remain active, yet stories circulate of battles lost, of tribute demanded rather than received, of authority negotiated rather than assumed. Perception matters. Neighbors see what Angkor's people may not yet fully feel, a great power whose center no longer holds with certainty. Confidence grows among rivals, not because Angkor has collapsed, but because it no longer adapts as quickly as the world around it. The empire's size, once its greatest strength, becomes a burden. Distance complicates response. Decentralized authority blurs command. Stone monuments impress, but they cannot move armies or redirect trade. As decades pass, pressure accumulates. Each encounter with rising neighbors leaves Angkor slightly diminished, not through catastrophe, but through comparison. Where others grow more agile, Angkor grows heavier. Where others invest in new routes and systems, Angkor maintains the old. Yet even now decline is not inevitable in the minds of those who live within the empire. Angkor has endured change before. It has adapted across centuries. Many believe it will do so again. What they do not yet see is that adaptation now requires a transformation deeper than infrastructure or ritual. It requires a reimagining of power itself, one that Angkor, bound to its ancient center, struggles to achieve. As the 14th century advances, the empire stands between past and future, revered and respected, yet increasingly surrounded by forces that no longer fear its reach. The world has changed, and Angkor, still majestic, feels the change pressing gently but persistently against its ancient walls. The long unraveling. Unraveling does not tear, it loosens. For Angkor, the 14th century becomes an age of gradual release, where systems that once held firm begin to slacken thread by thread. Nothing dramatic announces the change. There is no single decree, no great fire, no final battle that explains what follows. Instead, the empire eases into a quieter state, still functioning, still inhabited, but increasingly unbound from the discipline that once sustained it. The city remains immense. Causeways still stretch across moats. Towers still cast long shadows at dusk. Monks chant at dawn, and farmers work fields nourished by channels dug generations earlier. To the casual eye, Angkor endures. Yet endurance is not the same as vitality. Maintenance becomes the first quiet casualty. The hydraulic network, so dependent on continuous care, shows signs of fatigue. Silt gathers in canals more quickly than it is cleared. Embankments slump after seasons of heavy rain. Repairs are made, but unevenly guided by local initiative rather than central command. The system still works, but it no longer works together. These small inefficiencies accumulate. Water arrives late to some fields, too early to others. Yields fluctuate, surplus narrows. The empire's margin for error thins year by year. Population patterns shift almost imperceptibly. Some families move southward toward regions closer to trade and political opportunity. Others remain tied by land memory and faith. Angkor does not empty, it thins. The density that once filled its roads and reservoirs slowly disperses. At court, authority grows quieter. Kings still reign, but their voices do not carry as far. Decisions are increasingly shaped by negotiation with elites rather than command. Ceremonies persist, but they feel ceremonial in a new way, acts of continuity rather than engines of action. Elite families strengthen their local bases. Temple estates function with autonomy. Administrative knowledge fragments. Records become fewer. Memory shortens. Religion offers meaning amid this diffusion. Theravada Buddhism teaches acceptance of impermanence, and many find peace in its message. Suffering, change, and loss are framed not as failures, but as conditions of existence. This perspective softens the emotional shock of decline. What is fading feels natural, even appropriate. Stone monuments remain, but few new ones are built. Construction gives way to contemplation. The skyline of Angkor freezes in time, its greatest achievements already behind it. What was once the present becomes the past. External pressure continues to build. Border conflicts recur. Each encounter drains resources and confidence. Victories feel temporary. Defeats instructive. Rivals no longer test Angkor's strength cautiously. They test it persistently. Yet even now, there is no panic. Empires rarely recognize their ending from within. Life still makes sense. Rituals still hold meaning. The land still feeds its people most of the time. Angkor has survived crises before, and many assume it will survive this one as well. What has changed is not survival, but direction. The empire no longer expands. It no longer innovates. It preserves. Roads fall into disrepair. Distant regions slip from effective control. Communication slows. The sense of a shared imperial project fades into regional concerns and local rhythms. Angkor becomes a place of reverence rather than command, a capital of memory. The jungle responds patiently. Trees reclaim neglected embankments. Roots press into stone joints. Water pools where canals once ran clean. Nature does not conquer. It resumes. By the late 14th century, Angkor still stands, but it stands differently. It is no longer the unquestioned heart of a living empire. It is a city growing older, carrying centuries of achievement with quiet dignity. What remains is not collapse, but release, the loosening of bonds that once held millions together. The unraveling is almost complete. All that is left is a final turning when memory gives way to absence and the center of power moves elsewhere at last. 1431, the fall of Angkor. By the early 15th century, Angkor no longer feels like the center of the world, even to those who still live within its walls. It remains vast, ancient, and dignified, but the energy that once flowed outward from its heart now moves elsewhere. The city has become a place of memory sustained by habit and reverence rather than command. Stone causeways still cross wide moats. Reservoirs still hold water through the dry season. Monks still walk their familiar paths at dawn. Yet many of the forces that once animated this landscape, central authority, coordinated labor, imperial ambition, have quietly withdrawn. Power has already begun to migrate south, closer to the lower Mekong, and the maritime routes that now shape the region's wealth. Courts follow opportunity, and opportunity no longer gathers at Angkor. What remains behind is not abandonment, but pause, a long hesitation before departure. To the west, Ayutthaya has grown strong and self-assured. Its rulers understand that Angkor's greatness lies largely in its past. They do not face a unified imperial machine, but a venerable city surrounded by territories that no longer respond swiftly to its call. Pressure increases, not as a sudden invasion, but as a persistent presence raids, demands, tests of resolve. By 1431, the balance tips. The confrontation that follows does not resemble the great campaigns of earlier centuries. There is no thunderous clash recorded in epic detail. Instead, there is attrition. Supply lines strain. Defenses once formidable lack manpower and coordination. Allies hesitate, uncertain where loyalty now lies. Angkor is taken. The capture is noted briefly in chronicles almost without ceremony. This brevity is telling. The event is less a dramatic fall than the recognition of a reality already in place. What is lost is not the city itself, but the authority that once radiated from it. The royal court withdraws, relocating southward to safer and more practical centers of power. Administration follows. The machinery of empire leaves quietly, taking records, rituals, and decision-making with it. Angkor remains standing. Monks continue to inhabit temples. Villagers farm nearby fields. Pilgrims still visit sacred sites. Life does not end. It simply changes context. The city shifts from capital to relic, from command center to ancestral space. Without centralized maintenance, the great systems begin to fail more visibly. Canals clog, reservoirs fluctuate unpredictably, roads decay, forests press closer to stone. The jungle's return is not violent, it is patient, inevitable. Temples become quieter, Incense burns less often, roofs collapse gradually. Faces carved centuries earlier continue to gaze outward, untroubled by the passing of power. What disappears is coordination. Without court oversight, no single authority remains to organize labor at scale. Each village tends what it can. Each temple survives as long as local devotion sustains it. Angkor's transformation is slow enough that no generation witnesses the full change. Each sees only continuity mixed with slight loss. By the time absence becomes obvious, memory has already softened its meaning. The Khmer civilization does not end in 1431. It adapts, relocates, and endures. Language, belief, and identity continue. What ends is an imperial configuration tied to a specific place and system, a civilization built on stone permanence in a world that has learned to value movement. In time, Angkor becomes legend. Later visitors will speak of rediscovery as though the city were forgotten. But it was never lost to those who lived nearby. It simply stepped out of history's spotlight. As dusk settles over the abandoned causeways, shadows lengthen across carved walls. Water gathers quietly where canals once ran clear. The land exhales, returning to older rhythms. Empires rise when they learn to command time and nature. They fall when time reminds them that nothing is meant to stand forever. Angkor's story does not end in ruin, but in stillness, a stillness that holds centuries within it, waiting for those who walk slowly enough to listen. Silence, jungle, and memory. After the court withdraws and authority settles elsewhere, Angkor does not vanish. It lingers. In the years following 1431, the great city enters a different relationship with time. Without the steady presence of royal administration, life slows into quieter patterns. What had once been the nerve center of an empire becomes a vast, breathing landscape of memory, inhabited but no longer directed. Monks remain among the temples. Their chants echo softly beneath vaulted stone-filling spaces once shaped by royal ceremony. These sounds are gentler now, unhurried, aligned with a faith that teaches acceptance rather than command. Incense drifts upward in thin, wavering lines, disappearing into shadowed ceilings carved long before. Villagers continue to farm the surrounding land. Rice fields still follow the monsoon. Fishing boats still move across flooded forests when the lake swells. Life does not end because an empire recedes. It adapts, narrowing its focus to what can be sustained without centralized power. The hydraulic system, once coordinated across generations, becomes local. Small canals are kept clear where communities depend on them. Larger reservoirs fluctuate unpredictably, sometimes holding water, sometimes failing. Without empire-wide maintenance, the system fragments, functional in places, forgotten in others. Nature responds patiently. Trees take root along neglected embankments. Roots slip into cracks in stone walls, not with violence but with persistence. Moss spreads across carved surfaces, softening sharp lines and muting reliefs that once proclaimed divine order. The jungle does not conquer Angkor, it resumes it. Travelers still pass through the region. Some are monks moving between monasteries. Others are traders following older routes, now quieter than before. They see temples emerging from foliage towers, rising unexpectedly from green silence. The city feels ancient to them already, even as it remains inhabited. Memory shifts shape. Angkor is no longer spoken of as a center of command, but as a sacred place, an ancestral city. Stories gather around it of great kings, of miraculous construction, of times when the world felt more ordered. These stories are not records, they are inheritance. without the court inscriptions cease. Stone grows silent. The written voice of empire fades, replaced by oral memory carried in families and monasteries. What is remembered is not chronology, but meaning. Generations pass. Roofs collapse slowly. Wooden structures vanish almost entirely. Stone endures, but even stone changes. Edges round carvings soften faces, whether into expressions that seem less authoritative and more contemplative. The city becomes something different from what it was built to be. In later centuries, outsiders will speak of rediscovery as though Angkor were lost. But it is never lost to the people who live nearby. They know these temples. They pray in them. They pass them on roads and rivers. Angkor fades from global attention, not from local life. What disappears is the imperial gaze. Without kings to define its meaning, Angkor becomes open to interpretation. It can be sacred, mysterious, forgotten, or revered sometimes all at once. Its silence invites reflection rather than obedience. This silence is not emptiness. It is fullness of a different kind, a space where time accumulates rather than advances. Empires seek permanence through stone, yet stone too must eventually release its claims. What remains is not dominance, but presence. Angkor's presence settles into the land like a long memory. It waits, it listens. It holds centuries within its walls, even as vines and shadows reshape its outline. And as the world beyond moves forward, new kingdoms, rising trade routes, shifting histories, rewriting themselves, Angkor stays quietly teaching a lesson no empire can avoid. That power is loud, but endurance is silent. What endures? Long after empire fades, after courts withdraw, and banners fall silent, something remains. It is not power. It is not dominance. It is not even memory in its precise historical sense. What endures is quieter than all of these, woven into land belief and the slow habits of everyday life. Angkor endures not as a capital, but as a presence. Centuries pass. Forests thicken and recede. Kingdoms rise elsewhere, flourish and decline in their own time. Trade routes change, languages shift. Yet the stones of Angkor remain where they were placed, resting beneath sun and rain, bearing witness without speech. The Khmer people do not disappear with the empire. They adapt. Their political centers move southward, closer to rivers that now carry commerce toward the sea. New capitals rise humbler in scale, lighter in form. Authority becomes more flexible, less bound to stone permanence. Religion continues its quiet transformation. Theravada Buddhism becomes the spiritual backbone of Khmer society, shaping ethics, community life, and daily rhythm. Monasteries replace royal temples as centers of moral authority. The focus turns inward toward conduct, compassion, and acceptance of impermanence. Yet the older layers do not vanish entirely. Hindu cosmology, Mahayana compassion, and ancient animist beliefs remain embedded in ritual, art, and story. Khmer culture carries its past not as a single inheritance, but as a deep, layering belief, resting upon belief, memory resting upon memory. Angkor itself becomes a bridge across time. Pilgrims continue to visit its temples. Monks meditate beneath carved towers. Villagers pass its ruins as part of the living landscape. The city is no longer commanded, but neither is it forgotten. It exists in a different register outside politics, yet deeply human. In later centuries, foreign visitors arrive and marvel at what they see. They speak of mystery, of lost civilizations, of rediscovery. But Angkor was never truly lost. It simply stepped out of the rhythm of empire and into the longer rhythm of land and people. What Angkor leaves behind is not only architecture, but understanding. It teaches that water carefully guided can sustain millions, that belief, when shared, can organize entire societies, that power, when aligned with environment and labor, can achieve extraordinary things, and that even the greatest systems require constant care, humility, and adaptation. It also teaches restraint. Angkor shows that permanence is an illusion, even when carved into stone, that empires do not fall only through violence, but through quiet shifts in belief economy and attention. That decline can be gentle, almost tender, when a society learns to let go. Today, the legacy of the Khmer Empire lives on in Cambodia's language, religion, and sense of identity. It lives in rice fields shaped by ancient water knowledge, in temples where monks still chant at dawn, in stories passed quietly from one generation to the next. The stones of Angkor stand not as monuments to domination, but as reminders of balance between ambition and humility, between nature and design, between time and human effort. As evening settles over the plains, light fades across carved walls. Shadows gather in doorways once crossed by kings and pilgrims alike. The jungle hums softly. Water moves where it always has, guided by paths laid long ago. Nothing is hurried now. The empire has finished speaking, but the land continues its story. And if you listen closely, slowly, you may still hear it in the wind, through stone corridors, in the quiet breath of the lake, in the steady passing of centuries. Time moves on. Angkor remains,